So moving to McKeesport was quite a culture shock for Eric, but it was not all that different for me. It was kind of in a lot of ways like being home again on the north side of Minneapolis. The third ward of McKeesport, where we were living on Walnut Street, was virtually all African American, and I quickly made friends with a number of the neighbors. I found that in the Harrison Village public housing project there was a pretty decent outdoor basketball court, which I spent a lot of time at, and we could walk up the street to the contact center, which was the office of uh, the Office of Economic Opportunity, or OEO office, and there was also a bar or two that we liked to go to. There was Joe's Tavern. Across the street was the VFW, which was open 24 hours a day on weekends. And next to that was Dave's Walnut Inn, good place to go for drinks. And next to that was the Swing Club, where you could buy a beer for about 15 cents and a shot of whatever you wanted that was hard liquor for 25 cents. And there was a great jukebox that had the sermon by Jimmy Smith on the jukebox. So I quickly became acclimated to McKeesport, and also down the street was Beulah's, which was a soul food restaurant, very old style, run by a couple of older women. And if you went further on down the street, you would find the Theater Bar, which was where Billy Tarver liked to hang out. Reverend Billy Tarver, who was one of the board members of our organization. Also got to know a number of people who lived along the street and people who lived on some of the adjoining streets, like Locust Street, and in addition to Walnut Street. And there was, not too far off of Walnut Street, a little alley called Brick Alley, made famous by a book that I have. It was a street where you could find a number of brothels, and particularly one where the mayor and the police chief seemed to frequent. So McKeesport became home fairly quickly. The place that we lived in, the house that was owned by Betsy Davis, was one where she did a lot of informal child care, babysitting for neighbors' kids, and she was a wonderful babysitter. She was a kindly woman, and it was great to have the little kids around. We had a room on the second floor, Eric and I did, and one of the things that we found fairly early on about McKeesport is the construction of the houses was not all that great. In fact, some of the houses on Mrs. Davis' side of the street seemed to lean over against the brick building on the corner, which was the drugstore. And what that meant is that the windows weren't exactly square, and soot from the steel mill would blow in, making the windowsills very dark and dingy, and even the sheets and pillowcases quickly got soiled from the soot from the mills. This was the U.S. Steel National Tube Works mill, which employed probably about 15,000 workers at the time we were living there. So it was a fascinating place to live. You could walk from where we lived on 1242 Walnut Street down to the center of downtown in about 10 or 15 minutes, and we could walk down to a church that was on the would have been on the right side of the street walking toward downtown, where two ministers ran a kind of a community center, and where they had a gym in the basement, another place to play basketball. So between my work with the community in terms of just learning what I needed to learn about the way the community worked, and going to the Maniac office and the contact center office and hanging out and kind of acclimating myself to the community and its needs, I spent a lot of time just playing basketball and getting to know the kids. Um, in the public housing project, there was also a recreation center, and we had some terrific basketball games there in the evening. And again, another good way of getting to know people. So I made a lot of friends, and I got a lot of people interested in the work that we were doing, and we were particularly interested in some of the issues. There were lots of rats that came into the housing project from the adjoining river. The McKeesport had two rivers, not unlike Pittsburgh, which is three rivers, but the Youghiogheny and the Monongahela River joined at in downtown McKeesport, and then those two rivers, the Monongahela and the Allegheny, formed the Ohio in downtown Pittsburgh. So we, those of us that were VISTA volunteers, often congregated in a diner in downtown called the Club Car Diner. And it was there that we met Judy Lippert. Judy was the daughter of one of the steel workers that worked in the mill, and Judy kind of adopted us and invited us up to her parents' house on many occasions, and we could go up there, and whenever we stopped by to visit, Mrs. Lippert would always say, "Gee, you kids look kind of hungry, come on in." And she would open up the refrigerator and pull out whatever leftovers were there from the previous couple days, and the next thing you know, we'd have a wonderful meal with maybe 4 or 5 different courses to make a good lunch or dinner out of. She was very fond of calling things by the Hungarian name, I guess. She made things called hunky stew and hunky chicken, and no one seemed to find that insulting, because honky at the time was a pejorative name for white people. But her being white and being of Hungarian descent, I think, it was just fine. So Joe Isherwood and Linda Soner and B. Longo and I were frequent guests for lunch and dinner at the Lippert's house. And when we weren't eating dinner or lunch there, we were at the club car, and Judy, who was one of the waitresses there, told us that any time we wanted to come in, we could eat for free, and she would just stuff the check in her pocket, in her apron. And so breakfast at the club car was a regular affair, as was late night dinners. One of the things that Judy did point out to us, though, was to be careful about taking certain seats in the club car, because there was a guy that was connected to the local mafia who owned a nightclub, who held court in the club car late at night, and it was not a good idea to be in the booth that he liked to sit in when he came in. So we were very careful to avoid that particular booth. Across from the club car was a large supermarket, old-fashioned supermarket called Balsamos, and you could get just about anything you needed in Balsamos. The floors were just wooden slat floors, and there were big wooden tables with fresh fruits and vegetables. It was a wonderful place to shop, and was very much in keeping with the general character of McKeesport. And across the street was City Hall, and we could go to City Hall and watch the city council and the mayor in action, which was always kind of a entertaining thing to do. And then across Walnut Street was the office of the county's Office of Economic Opportunity, and that's where we met Marvin Fite and his colleagues, Tom Goodhart and Alex Powell, who had picked us up. We had occasional meetings there and talked about projects like keeping the daycare centers in Allegheny County open. There was a proposal to close those daycare centers, and especially the ones in McKeesport, where they were planning to cut funding for those centers. And we organized a demonstration with a number of the mothers who had kids in those daycare centers, and trucked them into downtown Pittsburgh to protest and to carry banners and so forth, protesting the action of the county commission. So daycare was an issue, nonprofit housing development was an issue, recreation funding from the city of McKeesport was an issue. Those were some of the things that we worked on well as my year in VISTA proceeded. And Joe Isherwood and I became very close friends. We sometimes played basketball up in Crestus Terrace, where Joe was assigned to a community center, and other times we would play in McKeesport. But we oftentimes had the use of Linda Soner's little white Rambler that she had brought with her to McKeesport, and eventually I was given a Ford Fairlane, a GSA vehicle, gray vehicle to drive. Having that vehicle was very helpful and important because transportation was pretty much limited. There was a train that could be taken from downtown Pittsburgh, or downtown McKeesport into downtown Pittsburgh, but it cost a couple bucks, and for a Vista living on $120 a month, that was a fair amount of money. And the buses were cheaper, but they took a long time, so that's how we basically got around, was using Linda's car and the GSA vehicle. I had a government credit card that I could put gas in the car with. One of the more interesting experiences I had with the GSA vehicle was I was heading towards Pittsburgh one day along Lyle Boulevard, the main street that ran, or highway that ran through downtown McKeesport. And one of the people that I worked with, a guy named Bugs, hailed me and asked me if I'd give him a ride over to Duquesne. So I agreed to drive him over. I was a little skeptical because I knew that Bugs was a kind of an unusual individual. I knew that he was using heroin, and I was concerned about that, but I agreed to take him over to Duquesne, so he instructed me where he wanted to go, and I took him to the public housing project there, and he asked me if I would wait on the street in the project for 10 or 15 minutes. He had to go run an errand. And the next thing I know, he was coming out of the door of one of the projects with a guy that I didn't recognize at all. And the guy, when he saw the car, the government car, was very agitated. And when the two of them jumped in the back seat, this guy was screaming at Bugs, saying, "What are you trying to do, get me arrested again? I just got out of jail, and here you are putting me in a government car." And Bugs said to him, "This is the safest place you could be." And the two of them took out their paraphernalia and shot up in the back of the GSA vehicle. I was, of course, extremely nervous about that, and I was eager for them to get out, and got them out and headed into Pittsburgh on my own errand. But I made up my mind I was never going to stop and give Bugs a ride again, with the danger that posed personal danger had I been stopped and arrested with the two of them. And it did turn out eventually that I did get arrested one night walking home from Major Mason's house. We were working on the community newspaper Now. That was the name of the newspaper Now, and it was late at night, and I was walking along, and I ran into a guy named Geach that I knew from the street, and it turned out that I found out later that Geach had smashed a window in a store and stolen a TV set out of the Firestone appliance store. And it wasn't long after that we had gone to a party on one of the streets just off of Walnut Street, and a cop car pulled up and a couple of other cars pulled up, and they arrested us at gunpoint and said that Geach had matched the description of the burglar, so they took us to jail, and they proceeded to book us. Now, it was clear that the booking sergeant or whoever he was used to booking black people, because when he asked for Geach's address and Geach gave him a third ward address, he just wrote down race, Negro, hair black, eyes brown, and the and then he said, "What's your occupation?" And Geach said, "I work in I forget where he worked, but he put down laborer." So then they had me step up, and without even looking up at me, he put down race, Negro, brown eyes, black hair, and said, "And where do you work?" And I said, "I'm a federal government employee. I'm a VISTA volunteer." And he put down laborer, and they put the two of us in a cell. So we were sitting there in the cell, and a police officer came by that Geach knew, and Geach said, "What's the? Why were we arrested? What am I doing in the cell?" And the police officer said, "There was a burglary in the area, and the description of the burglar was a black man with a white jacket. You fit the description, so you and your friend here were arrested, and you're going to have to appear before a judge on Monday morning." This was on a Saturday night. And so the officer told us that it would cost us $10 apiece to bail ourselves out. Between the two of us, we had a little more than $10, which would get one of us out, and so we both agreed that it would be better to get him out and that he could go and find friends and bail me out. And so we got him out, and he was only gone about 10 or 15 minutes and came back and had gotten enough money. I think he borrowed $10 from somebody he knew on the street and came back and bailed me out. As soon as I got out, I called Marvin, my VISTA supervisor, and explained to him what had happened. I don't think I knew at the time that Geach had actually stolen the television or broken into the store, but I found out later that he actually had done that. But I was kind of incensed that I was arrested for on something that I had nothing to do with, and so I called the emergency number we had in Washington and reported the incident to VISTA. And Marvin gave me the number for the neighborhood services lawyer, somebody named Bukich, and I called him, and then he had me call Moish Taxel, who was head of the local Human Relations Commission, and Moish arranged to have a police officer named, trying to remember his name, anyway, he came by and picked me up, gave me a ride up and down the street, and he really told me about things I didn't know about. For example, who on the street. He pointed out confectionery stores or candy stores where the real business that was going on was a sale of illegal numbers, and other places that were doing illegal businesses but were paying off to the police officers, were bribing the local police department. And the bagman for all of this was apparently the police chief. So I got a quick acquaintance with the way things worked for real in McKeesport. And he took me down Brick Alley and told me where the houses of prostitution were, and he also indicated to me which ones were favorites of the mayor and the police chief, and told me, that those were never going to be raided, or they were not going to be bothered by the police. So, thanks to Rip Holmes was the name of the police officer who gave me a ride, and on Monday morning I showed up at court with Marvin and Moish Taxel, and I was told by the attorney from legal services to just simply plead not guilty, pay whatever fine, and that they would take it to Pittsburgh to a real court, because we were going to a magistrate's court. And so we went to the court on Monday morning, and there were a couple of other defendants that were being charged. One of them was a guy who had been arrested for drunken driving, and he'd been arrested because the arresting officer had smelled liquor on his breath, and the attorney for the defendant said, well, did you offer him a breath test or any other way of determining that he was actually intoxicated? And the officer said, no, I just smelled liquor on his breath. And so the attorney said, well, I move for dismissal of charges for lack of evidence. And the magistrate, who was about to dismiss the charges, turned to the police chief, who was sitting next to him, and the police chief said, I say fine him $100 plus costs. And that's what happened. So the next case before the magistrate was a family that I had recognized from Harrison Village, a black family, a mother, father, and a couple of kids. And the magistrate asked them, or asked the policeman, why they were being charged, and he said they were being charged with shoplifting because he had gotten an argument with this gentleman over a parking ticket, and he noticed that there was a tear in the bag, the shopping bag that this man had, and he ordered him to produce receipts for everything that he had in his bag. And what he found out was that he didn't have receipts for a couple pair of socks that he'd bought in Greens, which was one of the 5 and 10 stores in downtown McKeesport. Now, it turned out that the cash registers in that part of the store didn't give receipts. They were mechanical cash registers, and the guy who had been arrested had convinced the clerk to come in and testify that there were no receipts given from that part of the store, from those machines. And so the magistrate once again was going to find this defendant not guilty, and the police chief once again said $100 plus costs, and that's what the magistrate did, was fine him $100 plus costs. So I was next, and the police officer that arrested us said there was a burglary in the area, and the description of the burglar was a black man with a white jacket, and this guy was walking with a black man with a white jacket on Walnut Street. So we ordered him to halt and arrested him for loitering. And I kind of laughed, chuckled out loud, and I said, well, I think, Your Honor, we all have a right to walk down the street, and I wasn't committing any crime, I wasn't loitering, I was moving along. And the magistrate said, well, you were in bad company. And I said, bad company, what do you mean? He said, well, the guy that you were walking with has been arrested in the past. And I said, oh, didn't know that. I said, what, was he convicted? And the magistrate looked at the record and said, no, he was never convicted, but he was somebody you shouldn't associate with. And I said, well, gee, I think in this country we have a freedom of association, and if he was never convicted, that should tell us something. And the police chief said, well, let's let him go for $20. And I started to laugh at that, and the police chief said, put him back in the cell. So one of the officers was grabbing me by the arm and pulling me towards the door that led to the cells again, and Marvin and Moish stepped up, and they said, we'll pay the $20. And so Marvin was paying the $20, and Moish, who knew the police chief, said, let's go and talk. And they went in the back room, and the police chief gave Moish the $20 back. So now we had our $20 back. We had the receipt for the $20 for the fine, and we were, on the advice of our attorney, headed to Pittsburgh to get this overturned. And I was out of jail, and so that's kind of what happened, and a pretty good description of the way justice worked in McKeesport. As a result of the kind of kangaroo court that they were running in McKeesport, I contacted the League of Women Voters and organized, along with the Neighborhood Legal Services, a court observation project, and we started sending volunteers, these nice suburban ladies, into magistrate courts, not only in McKeesport but around the county, to observe and document what was going on. And we actually succeeded in getting some court reform done over the coming year, thanks to the help from the League of Women Voters that publicized these terrible conditions in magistrates' courts. And so that was another thing that I was sort of proud of that we accomplished while I was a VISTA volunteer, because if you were arrested in a lot of these towns, there was no hope of any justice. You just knew you had to pay the fine, and that was it. So as time went on, I did get involved with the McKeesport Nonprofit Housing Development Corporation, which eventually became a pretty big deal, although not through any work that I did. And I got opportunities to work on some other issues as well. I have to say that my year in VISTA was probably one of the best years of my life. It was exciting, it was rewarding. There was a feeling that we as VISTAs were, some of us at least, were making a difference in the communities where we worked. We made a lot of friends, and we learned a lot about the way small-town Pennsylvania at least works, and probably other places like Ohio and West Virginia were not much different. And we had the opportunity to become lifelong friends with not only some of our VISTA colleagues, but with people that we met in these towns. I still stay in touch with Ann and Major Mason, and Joe Isherwood became, I would say, after the death of Boxey, my best friend. He was somebody who was the best man at our wedding, and I became godfather to his daughter, Colleen, and they're like family for us today. Marvin Fite and I have stayed very close friends. Aaron Mann, who I met later on, became a very close friend, and Marvin helped talk me into going to graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work, and helped me write my application for that school. So all in all, the year in VISTA proved to be an extremely important and interesting year for me. It was also during that year that Twyla was able to get her life back in order to some degree, and she and David came and lived at the apartment that I had on Ringgold Street for a few months, and I vividly remember taking her out one night when we had a babysitter, and I took her up on Walnut Street to the Walnut Inn and the swing club, and I think it made all of the other girls that lived in McKeesport, in the area where I worked, kind of jealous, because Twyla was a very beautiful girl, and she dressed very smartly, and I think a lot of the guys were quite taken by her. Also remember one night in particular, because we were paid so little that when she was there, we had we were approaching a weekend, and we were almost out of food. We had probably a little bit left of a loaf of bread and a can of tuna fish, as I recall. And we had decided we just weren't going to eat for the next couple of days so we could feed David, who was not even 2 years old at the time. And it was kind of late at night, maybe 9 or 10 o'clock at night. There was a knock on the door, and there was Major standing there with a large bag, and came in, set it on the kitchen table, and as we opened it up, it was full of groceries. And Major just looked at me and said, "I heard you were hungry," and turned around and walked out the door. But it was an example of how good friends we had made, and how people were loving and caring of us as VISTA volunteers and as friends in McKeesport. So I decided I would complete my year and return to Minneapolis and look for a job there. But before I had a chance to go back, it was the middle of the summer, and I was going to go early and look for a job, and I got a call from my friend Bruce Bastian, who had just gotten out of the Marine Corps in San Diego. And Bruce had bought a Citroen, and he had driven it all the way across the South and up the East Coast, and now he was heading from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, and he was offered to pick me up, and the two of us would drive back to Minneapolis together. So he stopped and picked me up, and we began our journey, the first of 3 or 4 long road trips that we made together. And this turned out to be kind of an adventure, because the Citroen had a wiper blade on the driver's side that kept falling off. And we ended up on more than one occasion having to stop the car and find the wiper blade on the highway. And it was raining that night, so we drove all the way to Indianapolis to avoid tolls, and then drove up through Decatur, Illinois, where he had a girlfriend, and we stopped, and his girlfriend made breakfast for us, and then we drove the rest of the way to Minneapolis. When I got to Minneapolis, and Bruce dropped me off at 5239 Logan, I found that Mom and Dad had left to go out west for a couple of weeks, and the house was locked up, and I was counting on them to borrow, to loan me some money so I could get back to McKeesport. But I doubted very much if I would find any money in the house. I did have a way to get into the house. I think I had a way that I'd figured out to get through a basement window. And as I knew I could expect, the refrigerator was full of food, so I was able to eat for the next week or so. But there was no money to be found around the house, and my brother Pat was not around either. I forget where he was, but there was nobody to see if I could borrow money from. So I had to figure out a way to get back, and I looked in the Minneapolis paper, and I saw an ad for a company that delivered cars, where you could just pick up a car in a particular town, and they would give you money for gas, and you could drive the car back to wherever they wanted delivered. And I found out that they had I called the company, which was located in Hopkins, and they had a couple cars going east. but one of them was leaving it when I wanted to leave, and it was going from Tennessee to Long Island. And I figured if I could get to Long Island, I could figure out a way to get back to Pittsburgh from there. So I called them and went out, hitchhiked out to their office and filled out the paperwork, and they gave me an envelope with some money in it and some other things, and turned out that the car was actually in Knoxville, Tennessee. Actually, it was in Nashville, and they were going to fly me to Knoxville, and then I was going to take a bus from Knoxville to Nashville and pick up the car there, and then I had to drive it to Long Island. And that was quite an adventure. On the flight down, almost everybody on the flight was going to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. They were all Army servicemen. And when I got to Knoxville's airport, I had cab money to go to the bus depot, and that's where I took the bus, and I met a couple of students from Lincoln University in Missouri, a historically black college, and spent a good time with them on the bus talking about a whole variety of things. And we ended up at the bus depot in Nashville, and there were a couple of what you might call rednecks who were looking at us very angrily. Evidently they didn't appreciate an interracial group sitting and laughing and talking and having coffee in the bus depot. And so they decided to follow me, and they followed me all the way from Nashville to Bristol, Tennessee, to a little truck stop where I stopped, and then they were playing some very racist songs on the jukebox in the truck stop, and I beat it out of there as quickly as I could. It's a good thing they gave me a big Chevy with a big V8, because I was doing over 100 miles an hour from Bristol till I hit the West Virginia Turnpike and headed north to Charlotte, where I had a friend, in Charleston, West Virginia, and then borrowed some money there and headed north to Pittsburgh. When I got to Pittsburgh, I contacted my friend Vinnie Rapoli, who was a VISTA volunteer from the next group, and Vinnie wanted to go back to New York because he was from Brooklyn, and he wanted to go and see his mother, so the two of us shared driving into New York. And when we stopped in Brooklyn to see his mother, turned out she had been laid off, so she fed us some Italian sausage and scrambled eggs for breakfast, but she didn't have any money to give us, and so I was able to take the car out to Long Island and drop it off and get back to Brooklyn, but I had no idea how I was going to get back to McKeesport. So it was late, and I called the OEO office and asked for Marvin, because I thought maybe Marvin could help. And when I reached the secretary, she told me Marvin was already in New York, and he was going to be there over the weekend. And so she gave me the telephone number. I contacted Marvin, and Vinnie and I both piled into Marvin's big Dodge, and we made it back to McKeesport in plenty of time for work on Monday. So it was a great adventure. And with that, my year in VISTA was coming to an end, and I was packing up, and I got another one of these You Drive It cars, a big Chevy station wagon that was going from Pittsburgh to Minneapolis. And I remember sitting on a hill overlooking McKeesport, and I know I had a tear in my eye because I knew I wouldn't be coming back to McKeesport anytime soon, although I did come back for several visits after that. But it did feel like the end of an era in my life, and one that was very important to me, and one that I knew that I would never forget. And so I will leave this chapter here, and the next chapter I'll pick up returning to Minneapolis, going to work at the the Dykeman Hotel and eventually getting a job at Pillsbury Waite Neighborhood Services.